Wendy, Darling, by Christopher Golden. On a Friday evening at the end of May in the year 1915, Wendy spent her final night in her father's house in a fitful sleep, worried about her wedding the following day, the secret she had kept from her intended groom. The room had once been a nursery, but those days were all but forgotten. She'd stopped dreaming the dreams of her girlhood years before, such that even the echoes of those dreams had slid into the shadows in the corners of the room. Now it was a proper bedroom with a lovely canopy over the bed and a silver mirror and an enormous wardrobe that still gave off a rich mahogany scent that had stood against the wall for 6 years and more. Some nights the tall French windows would remain open, the curtain would billow and float. On those evenings, the moonlight would pour into the room with such earnest warmth it seemed intent upon reminding her of girlhood evenings when she would stay up, whispering to her brothers in the dark till all of them drifted off to sleep and dreamt impossible things. Wendy had lived in the nursery with Michael and John for too long. She ought to have had her own room much sooner, but at first her father had not wanted to give up his study to make another bedroom, and later, when he changed his mind, the children were no longer interested in splitting up. By then, Wendy had begun to see the Lost Boys, to dream of them. It seemed altogether safer to stick together. That day, the day before her wedding, there had been a low, whispering sort of fog all around the afternoon and into the evening. Several times she stirred in her sleep, uneasy at the thought of Jasper, the barrister she was about to wed the following afternoon. She quite relished the idea of becoming Mrs. Jasper Gilbert, yet during the night she felt herself haunted by the prospect. Each time her eyes flickered open, she lay for several moments staring out at the fog until she drifted off again. Some time later she woke up to see not fog but moonlight. The windows were open, and the curtains performed a ghostly undulation cast in yellow light. A dream, she thought, for it must have been. She knew it because the fog had gone. Knew it because of the moonlight and the impossibly slow dance of those curtains, and of course because the Lost Boys were there. She lay on her side, half her face buried in the feather pillows, and gazed at them. At first she saw only 3, 2 by the settee, one almost hidden in the billows of the curtains. The 4th had a dark cast to his features that made him seem grimmer, less ethereal than the others, though he was the youngest of all. She had not seen them in years, not since her parents had gotten a doctor involved, insisting that the Lost Boys were figments of her imagination. She had never forgiven John and Michael for reporting her frequent visits with the Lost Boys to their parents, a grudge she'd come to regret in the aftermath of Michael's death in a military fire in 1910. How she had loved him. By the time of the fire, it had been years since she had seen the Lost Boys. After the fire, she'd often prayed that it would be Michael who visited her in the night. "Wendy," one of the boys whispered now in her moonlit dream. "Hello, boys," she said, flushed beneath her covers, heart racing. She wanted to cry or scream, but did not know if it was fear she felt or merely grief. As if grief could ever be merely. She recognized all 4 of them, of course, and knew their names. She did not allow herself to speak these names, or even to think them. Would have felt as if she welcomed them back to her dreams, and they were not welcome at all. "You forgot us, Wendy. You promised you never would." She nestled her cheek deeper into her pillow, feathers poking her skin through the fabric. "I never did," she whispered, her skin dampening, too hot beneath the covers. "You're only in my mind, you see. I haven't forgotten. My parents and Dr. Goss told me I must persuade my eyes not to see you if you should appear again." "Have you missed us, then?" Wendy swallowed. A shudder went through her. She had not. "As I'm dreaming, I suppose it's all right that I'm seeing you now." The Lost Boys glanced at one another with a shared, humorless sort of laugh. More sniff than a laugh, really. A disapproving sniff. The moonlight passed right through them. The nearest of them, he of the grim eyes, slid closer to her. "You were meant to be our mother," he said. Wendy couldn't breathe. She pressed herself backward away from them. It was their eyes that ignited a terror within her, those pleading eyes. She closed her own. "Wake up, Wendy," she whispered to herself. "Please wake up." "Don't you remember?" the grim-eyed one asked, and her lids fluttered open to find herself still dreaming. "Please remember," said another. a lithe little boy with a pouting mouth and eyes on the verge of tears. "No," she whispered. The hook, soft flesh against her own, the pain, blood in the water. Her body trembled as the images rushed into her mind and were driven back, shuttered in dark closets, buried in shallow graves. "Stay away," she whispered. "Please. My life is all ahead of me." She did not know if she spoke to the lost boys or to those images. "My fiancé is a good man. Perhaps when we are wed, we could take one or two of you in. He's kind, you see, not like—" A door slammed in her mind. "Like who, Wendy?" "Hooks," she thought. "My James." "No," she screamed, hurling back her bed covers and leaping from the bed, hot tears springing to her eyes. "Leave me, damn you! Leave me to my life!" Fingers curved into claws. She leaped to the nearest of them. Passing through them, chilled goose flesh rippled across her skin. She found the dragon curled up into herself, a mess of sobs. In moonlight, she lay just out of reach of the fluttering curtains, cried herself into the sweet, oblivious depths of slumber. When she woke in the early dawn, aching and chilled to the bone, she crept back beneath her bedclothes for warmth and comfort, told herself that there would never be another night when she needed to fear bad dreams. For the rest of her life, she would wake in the morning with Jasper beside her. He would hold her and kiss her till last of sleep's shadows retreated. The sun rose to a clear blue morning. No trace of a fog. The world only began to feel completely real to Wendy again when the carriage drew to a halt in front of the church. Flowers had been arranged over the door and on the steps. The beauty of the moment made her breath catch in her throat. A smile spread across her lips and bubbled into laughter. She turned toward her grumpy banker of a father, so that he was smiling as well, beaming, in fact. His eyes were damp with love for her and with pride. "Never thought you'd see the day, did you, Father?" Wendy teased. George, darling, cleared his throat to compose himself. "There were times," he allowed himself, "but here we are, my dear. Here we are." He took a deep breath and stepped out of the carriage. Itself also festooned with arrangements donated by friends of Wendy's mother, who were part of the committee behind the Chelsea Flower Show. A pair of ushers emerged from the church. Wendy's father waved them back and offered his own hand to guide her down the carriage steps. George stepped back. He'd never been sentimental. Now he seemed to fight against whatever emotions welled within him. Amongst those she expected, Wendy saw a flicker of uneasiness. "You look beautiful," he told her. Wendy knew it was true. She seldom indulged in outright vanity, but on her wedding day, and in this dress, well, she would forgive herself. Cream white satin, trimmed in simple lace. It had been one of the very first she laid eyes upon it, and she had loved it straight away. Cut low at the neck, with sleeves to the elbows, had a simple elegance reflected in the simplicity of the veil and the short train. Her father helped gather her train, spread it out behind her, took her hand as they faced the church. "Miss Darling," said one of the ushers, whose name she'd suddenly forgotten. She felt horrible. It seemed that her thoughts were a jumble. "I'm about to be married," she said, just to hear the words aloud. "You are, my dear," George agreed. "Everyone is waiting." The forgotten usher handed her a wreath of orange blossoms, and then the other one opened the church door, and moments later, Wendy found herself escorted down the aisle by her grumpy-turned-doting father. The trumpet played, and then the organ. All faces turned toward her, so that she saw all of them and none of them at the same time. She smelled the flowers. Her heart thundered. She began to feel dizzy and swayed a bit. "Wendy," her father whispered to her, his grip tightening on her arm, "are you all right?" Ahead at the end of the aisle, the bridesmaids and ushers had spread out to either side. The vicar stood on the altar, dignified and serious. Her mother sat in the front row. Her brother John stood amongst the ushers. And there was Jasper, so dapper in his morning coat, his black hair gleaming, his blue eyes smiling. She no longer felt dizzy, only safe and sure. Until the little boy darted out from behind to call him. The little boy with grim eyes. "Stop this," he shouted. "You must stop!" Wendy staggered, a terrible pain in her belly as if she were being torn apart inside. She gasped and covered her mouth, glancing about her through the mesh of her veil, certain her friends and relations would think her mad. Again. They would think her mad again. But their eyes were not on her. Those in attendance were staring at the little boy in his ragged clothes. When the second boy ran in the door to the sacristy, and the vicar shouted at him, furious at the intrusion, when he at last understood. The vicar could see the boys. They could all see. "Out of here, you little scoundrels," the vicar shouted. "I won't allow you to ruin the day." The grim-faced boy stood before Jasper, who could only stare in half-amused astonishment. The sweetness was simply Jasper's nature. The indulgence where any other bridegroom would have been furious. The third boy stepped from the shadows at the back of the altar as if he had been there all along. And of course, he must have been. "No, no, no," Wendy said, backing away, tearing her arm from her father's grip. She forced her eyes closed because they couldn't be here, couldn't be real. "Wendy," her father said. She opened her eyes to see him looking at her. He knew. Though he had always told her they were figments and dreams, hadn't he seemed unsettled whenever she talked of them? Spirits, he'd said, do not exist, except in the minds of the mad and the guilty. "Which am I?" she'd asked him then. "Which am I?" Jasper clapped his hands twice, drawing all attention toward him. The unreality of the moment collapsed into tangibility and truth. Wendy breathed, smelled the flowers, heard the scuffling and throat-clearing of the stunned members of the wedding. "All right, lads, you've had your fun," Jasper said. "Off with you." "Wendy, darling," one of the boys said, staring at Jasper, tears welling in his eyes. "Why, she's not darling at all. You don't know her, sir. She'll be a cruel mother. She'll abandon her children." "Rubbish!" shouted Wendy's father. "How dare you speak of my daughter this way?" Wendy could only stare, not breathing, as Jasper strode toward the grim-eyed boy, gripped him by his ragged shirt front. She saw the way the filthy fabric bunched in his hands, felt as if the curtain between dream and reality had finally been torn away. "No," she said, starting toward Jasper and toward the boys. "Please don't." Her fiancé glanced up, thinking she had been speaking to him. The boys looked at her as well. They knew better. "She's had a baby once before," a pale, thin boy said, coming to stand by Jasper, his eyes pleading. "Go on. Ask her." "Ask her what became of that child," said the grim-eyed boy. Shaking, Wendy jerked right and left, trapped by all the eyes that gazed upon her. Jasper frowned, staring at her. She saw the doubt blossoming in him, saw his lips beginning to form a question. Her father still glared angrily at the boys, but even he had a flicker of hesitation. In front row, Mary Darling stepped from the pew and extended a hand toward her daughter. "Wendy?" Shaking her head, Wendy began to back away from those who loved her, retreating down the aisle. She tripped over her silken train, and when she fell amongst the soft purity of its folds, she screamed. "Ask her!" one of the boys shouted, or perhaps it had been all of them. Thrusting herself from the ground, whipping her train behind her, she ran. Her whole body felt flushed. She caught a glimpse of her left hand as she ran, and it was pale as marble, pale as death. At the back of the aisle, a few crimson rose petals had fallen, petals meant to be scattered in the path of husband and wife after the ceremony. To her, they were blood from a wound. She burst from the church, an abyss of unspoken questions gaping behind her. She fled down the steps in fear that if she did not run, the yawing silence would drag her back. Pain stabbed her belly and her heart slammed inside her chest. Her eyes burned, and yet strangely there were no tears. She felt incapable of tears. At the foot of the steps, she tore off the train of her dress. When she glanced up, horses whinnied and chuffed. A wedding carriage stood waiting. The driver looked at her with kind eyes, and his kindness filled her with loathing. "Wendy!" Jasper's voice, behind her. She dared not turn to look at him. Racing across the street, she darted down a narrow road between a dressmaker's and a baker's shop. At a corner, she nearly collided with two more of the lost boys. Names, you know their names. She turned right to avoid them, racing downhill now. Another appeared from an alley to her left, but this boy was different from the others. He'd been badly burned, skin and clothing charred. Unlike the rest, he had no substance, flesh so translucent she could see the stone face of the building behind him. She wailed, stumbling in anguish, and fell to the street. Her dress tore and her knee bled, so that when she staggered to her feet and ran screaming, grief carving out her insides, vivid red stains soaked into the satin and spread, the petals of a crimson rose. "Mother," the boy said behind her. She did not look back. glanced once at the windows of a pub as she bolted past. In the glass she saw the reflections, not only the burnt boy but the others as well. One with his head canted too far, neck broken, another beaten so badly his features were ruined. Moments before she emerged from between two buildings, she realized where she'd been going all along. Had she chosen her path, or had they driven her here? Did it matter? Wendy stared at the bank of the Thames, the deep water rushing by. All the strength went out of her. Numb and hollow, she shuffled to the riverbank. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried. Glancing to her left, she saw the bundle perhaps a dozen feet away, just at the edge of the water. The baby's wailing grew louder and more urgent, and she started toward it. She knew the pattern on its blanket. His blanket. Kneeling on the riverbank, her blood-stained dress soaked up the damp, she reached out to pull the blanket away from the infant's face. His blue face, bloated and cold, eyes bloodshot and bulging and lifeless. The sob tore from her chest as she reached for the child, lifted it into her arms, and cradled it to her chest. Still she could not weep. She pressed her eyes tightly closed and prayed for tears. The bundle in her arms felt too light. Gasping for breath, she opened her eyes. "No, please," she whispered. She unraveled the empty blanket, the empty, sodden blanket. "Mother," the voice said so close, and a hand touched her shoulder. Wendy froze, breath hitching in her chest. This was not the burnt boy, the grim-faced child from the church. This was another boy entirely. Still on her knees, she turned back to see his face. 9 years old now, his skin still blue, eyes still bloodshot and lifeless. Her boy. "Peter," she whispered. He thrust his fingers into her hair, and she screamed his name, a name she had never spoken aloud before today. Wendy beat at his arms and clawed at his face as he dragged her to the water and plunged her into the river. She stared up at him through the water. His visage blurred and changed, became the face of his father, James, the butcher's boy. He'd earned his nickname with a blood-stained hook he used in handling the sides of meat in the shop down the street from the Darlings' home. Her chest burned for air, urgency of her need forcing her to strike harder at the face above her, which now became her own face, only 9 years younger. The hands that held her beneath the water were her own, but she was no longer herself. Instead, she was a tiny infant, so newly born, but he still bore streaks of blood from his mother's womb. An infant conceived by a mother and father who were only children themselves, carried and born in secret safeguarded by her brothers in the privacy of the room they shared, a secret which destroyed her relationship with them forever, a secret made possible by a father's neglect and a mother's denial. Peter, she thought. Starved for air, thoughts and vision dulling, diminishing, slipping away. Wendy opened her mouth and inhaled the river. Blackness crept in at the corners of her eyes, shadows in her brain. She realized she'd stopped fighting him. Her arms slipped into the water and her hair pooled around her face. Blood-stained white satin floated in a cloud that enveloped and embraced her. The hands on her now were larger, a man's hands. They dragged her from the river, and for a moment she saw only darkness, a black veil for a cruel mother. "Wendy," said an urgent voice. She saw him then. Not the little drowned boy, but Jasper, her intended. He knelt over her, desperate and pleading and calling her name. Gathered around him on the riverbank were the lost boys, those cast-aside children, each murdered by his mother. These dead boys she had met once before, the night she had drowned her Peter in the Thames. They had pointed trembling fingers and told her she would carry the black curse of murder all her days. She might be allowed to approach happiness, but never achieve it. They were the stains on her soul. They had been visible to the people in the church. Dark dreams come to life. Now they were unseen once more. Jasper wept over her, unaware of their presence. Wendy could only watch him, standing a short distance away. Her dress felt dry now, but the bloodstain remained. "No," she whispered, as the darkness retreated from her thoughts and she understood what she saw. Jason knelt there, mourning her, grieving for the life they might have had. Wendy saw her own lifeless body from outside, her spirit as invisible to him as the lost boys. Others began to run toward the riverbank, her parents and her brother John, the vicar's wife and Jasper's brother, an aunt and uncle. They seemed like ghosts to her, these living people, their grief distant and dull. The lost boys circled around her, dead eyes now contented. "Mother," Peter whispered, taking her right hand. Another boy took her left hand. She glanced down and saw the grim eyes that had so unsettled her in her dreams. "You promised to be a mother to us all forever," the grim-eyed boy said. Wendy blinked and turned toward the river. Somehow she could still see the swaddled infant floating on the water, sodden blankets dragging it down, just as it had on that night 9 years ago. "Forever," said Peter. They guided her gently into the river, where the dark current swept them all away.